before talking about what I think good goals would be, I think the question you're actually asking about is a goal-oriented framework actually a adequate or good framework, or are there other frameworks we want to take? And so obviously Western culture has been, and particularly post-industrial, post-scientific, technological, and even computational culture has been very oriented to goals kind of process. And we can attribute both lots of successes and most of the failures of the world, or many of the failures of the world, to that process. Because if I define a goal and it doesn't include everything that will be affected by the nature of what I do to get there, then whatever is affected that I didn't define as part of my goal is the space where externalities can happen.
Yep.
And even in the, very well-intentioned nonprofit, whatever kinds of sectors, we see all the time having things like, okay, so we have a goal to end extreme poverty and childhood hunger globally or within a particular area. That seems like a pretty awesome goal, especially if you've ever seen a child who's hungry or a mother watching her child be hungry.
Yep.
The tricky thing is, if my only goal is to end hunger, I can do it through unrenewable agricultural methods that dump nitrogen into river deltas, moving dead zones in the ocean even faster. Moving us towards actually extinction as a species and collapse of the biosphere writ large, which is, okay, so we prevented some people from dying over the very short term and made it more likely that everyone dies over the medium term.
Yep.
So at minimum, when we think about goals, we could at least just start by this hand-wavy kind of thing of saying our goal is X, whatever X is, right? Stop extreme poverty.
Yep.
And just add this little caveat, which is our goal is to do that and not externalize harm to anything else that matters. And now when you start exploring, how do I know what else might be affected that could have harm externalized that isn't obvious in very complex systems and with technology that has lots of different causal dynamics that are associated? And then the question of what are other things that matter and what is my ethical and existential framework for assessing that? Then you start to realize that that kind of hand wave leads way to a much deeper process of what we might call omni-consideration.
Yeah, so let me pause you for a second actually there, because I think that there's a lot of good juicy stuff. As you said, we're kind of so used to thinking of this goal framework, and it's hard to get out of it in some ways. And like you say, I super agree with you. Say, once we create a goal, whatever that goal is, X, and you also have to say, what are all the externalities of X, and how can we make sure that we're minimizing the negative externalities and upping the positive externalities of that X? Is there, I guess, to go a little bit deeper on that, this kind of goals perspective, and you kind of started to allude to this to some extent, is like there are people in the world. So I would say I'm like a relative kind of effective altruist maximalist, in terms of I agree with, generally agree with like consequentialism and kind of outcome focused, ends focused mindsets. And those are all kind of they have kind of goals as a part of them. So how do you think about something like effective altruism as kind of mostly a goal focused or kind of an outcome focused mindset? Is that good for shaping the world positively?
Effective altruism is a valuable step in the consideration process of saying, if we really care about having actions that have a positive impact on life writ large, how do we go about influencing our choice-making basis of what will be effective? And how can we use very effective tools like rationality to inform better choice? So insofar as it's asking what are the right epistemic frameworks to inform good choice, that's a great step. Now, of course, I'm going to say that it is a limited step, and the limits are actually fatal. And so more steps in the direction of informing good choice have to happen. So here's a couple examples. When we talk about the limits of goals, because the goal is always embedded within a larger context, and so you have to factor the embedding functions, and that's where the topic of externality comes. And how we even think through externality, we're mostly only going to forecast within domains that we already know a lot. So as we're getting into exponential technology, where there are faster rates of change, more complicated, more complex systems, etc., then there's more stuff that's going to happen that we don't forecast well. And faster coupling from the micro context to the macro context. It used to be that whatever happened in a micro way, it wasn't going to affect the biosphere or human civilization writ large, because stone tools just don't have as big a consequence as AI or nanotech or biotech do. And so because of the larger scale and faster timeline coupling coefficients of micro action to macro dynamics, externality is that much bigger of a topic, right? And it's an exponentially bigger topic. So let's just take small cases and then look at what happens when you put that on an exponential curve. So say we take medicine, because in medicine, we're talking about what is health, but in a body, that's a complex system. But we take a complicated approach of trying to define health in terms of a finite number of metrics. So we're going to look at your low-density lipoprotein and your high-density lipoprotein and a couple different cholesterol metrics and blood pressure and blood sugar and whatever, right? And as time goes on, we look at more and more metrics, but then the idea is that there's a range in which we want to see those metrics. And so then the goal is, at first, we can just say, okay, your cholesterol is too high, our goal is to lower cholesterol. That seems like a reasonable thing if I have a reason to think that high cholesterol increases the probability for certain diseases. But now I have to dig a little bit deeper. And this first step is obvious. The second step is more important. The first step says, okay, when I say cholesterol is high, so I want to lower it, giving a statin drug actually works and makes sense. I'm going to lower low-density lipoprotein. I did not ask why the cholesterol was high in the first place. Is that possibly a protective mechanism to the arterial system from some type of oxidative damage or toxicological damage or whatever that's arising from? Is it a sign of other systems, homeodynamic systems, being out of balance, where just addressing that symptom means underlying other pathoetiology will continue? Is there a side effect on metrics other than LDL, and maybe ones that we haven't even measured and done longer-term analysis on of the method that we're using, et cetera? So then we can say, well, the statin works for that, but now the system is more dependent on it. Its own ability to regulate cholesterol is less good. Why it was off, we still don't know. And the side effects of the statin might be things like liver toxicity and brain toxicity. So we say, okay, well, that's not the best method, but that is still our method, right? That's how we do medicine. And it's why, if you think about medicine, we have really amazing acute medicine and really terrible chronic medicine. So in acute medicine, meaning if we know the acute onset of the illness, like you just got shot, and the problem is a bullet that went in, we can take the bullet out, sew it up, and there isn't deeper underlying, more complex causation. That's pretty straightforward, and we're really good at that. You just got an acute infection, you just got an acute poisoning. We can deal with those things pretty well. But when we talk about psychiatric disease or autoimmune disease or neurodegenerative disease or cancer or anything that doesn't have one obvious immediate cause, you'll notice that for the most part, we don't have anything that actually looks like a real cure or prevention. We have symptomatic treatment, and we might have things at slow rates of progression. And the reason we don't, and so cancer is a classic example, we can cut a cancer out, we can radiate it out, we can poison it out, but we're not that good at saying why is it growing in a way that it wasn't when the person was younger and that it doesn't in other people, and how do we actually address that? Because it doesn't have one cause. It has a whole bunch of different causes, and they're not even the same set of causes in different people. So now we have to actually not do a generalized bell curve approach, but do a let's understand this complex system uniquely, factoring multifactorial causation, delayed causation, causal cascades, shit that we are epistemically not that good at. We do the same thing for the world. When we're saying we want to feed kids in this area, and we're not saying what is wrong with a macroeconomy that actually creates poverty, and what, et cetera. Like, what are the actual causes of this problem, and then of a particular solution that we're going to come up with that doesn't address the causal dynamics well? What are the side effects of that solution going to be? Is this agricultural method going to lead to more nitrogen runoff, leading to larger dead zones in the ocean that is actually worse for everyone long-term and writ large? And so what we find is then we look at the LDL and say, okay, so we want to look at LDL and these liver enzymes and a few other things. And then we try and put more metrics and run optimization on those metrics, which then we say big data and and machine learning will help us do. But this is the key thing. No matter how many metrics, there's a couple things here. When we say that goals are limited, we also are saying that optimization theory is limited for a couple critical reasons. So now I go from 2 metrics to 200 or 2,000 metrics. But there's still other things that are happening that are outside of the metrics that I'm seeking to optimize, that are mostly in either the beyond factorable within this model or the actual unknown unknowns, but that might be critical to the whole system. And so when I'm running optimization on these n metrics, I'm also affecting a lot of other stuff that I'm not paying attention to optimize, which is the places where I'll probably externalize harm, as I'm driving a system where all those things are interconnected without actually acknowledging they're interconnected. In other words, our model of a complex system is not how the complex system actually works. So when we treat the actual reality as the model and we try and optimize for the model, the place in which the reality is not the model gets fucked up.
Yeah.
And so when you define a complex system as something that has an emergent property beyond how you model it, when you model it, you get certain system dynamics. Awesome. Complicated system. Complex system is the predicted dynamics of the model don't explain all of the dynamics. Then you have to say, is there a different epistemology other than n-dimensional metrics and optimization theory to account for what is actually going on?
So pause for a second. So I agree with a lot of that, and I want to talk about that in a sec, but so you talked about I agree that there's a bad forecasting piece where we live in this world where we have black swan style events and we're hyper interconnected, lots of power, lots of exponentials happening. And when all that happens, if we set our goals and then don't account for the externalities of our actions, then the sad externalities can turn out to be really big because everything's so interconnected and powerful now. And I agree with what you're saying when you think about any of these actions, and this gets into how kind of to think about this stuff. It's like when you think about taking an action, before you do it, think, A, why is there this problem in the first place, to try to go to that root cause level? And then B, what are the externalities of that action? So, and in this final piece, what you're getting to here is this map is not the territory thing here. And it's especially true for complex systems. And so I just kind of want to recap all of that stuff for our listener and then have you go and say, okay, so if we can't use this, if I can't just keep adding metrics to my space, what is the new epistemology that I should be thinking about that will actually allow me to, and allow us to succeed in this new world?
Right. So I want to share another framework that will help the consideration here. And this is not a happy thought at first, but it's a necessary thought, which leads us to be more effective in considering how to have happy thoughts around this. So it is that it is a lot easier to break shit than it is to actually protect or build stuff. And there is a entropic preference that we have to consider. And just to have a very simple kind of prima facie of that, the house that I'm in probably took a year to build, and a wrecking ball could take it down in minutes. Mm-hmm. And if you think about an old growth forest and the thousands of years it takes to get the biodiversity and complexity of that forest, and how long it takes with a fire or a D9 to take it down, you really get a sense of the orders of magnitude of the timelines for construction versus destruction of complicated or complex systems. And everything from things like that, how long does it take to build a globalized infrastructure and how quickly could we actually break it, all the way to how long does it take to build trust and how easy is it to break it. And so when you factor that, you realize that there's a couple orders of magnitude more ways to break stuff than to build it, and faster time processes on that. So when I'm factoring externalities and I'm thinking about some new technological capacity, and I can't actually forecast the possible externalities well, because I don't even know that space. I'm opening up a new epistemic space with new types of causal dynamics and feedback loops and couplings that are very hard to think about. And there is an orientation that there will be more total ways of having destructive effects than constructive, and that they will be faster. This is something we have to consider very deeply. And when you can imagine, like when we first got stone tools down, we killed a lot of things faster than we ever had before, and we started the beginning process of species extinction, human-induced species extinction. When we first started kind of figuring out fire, we burned a lot of shit down before we got good at containing fire. But when you move up to AI and nanotech and biotech and things that are pattern replicating tech, meaning that the failure of the thing is not just that it caused a problem, but that it causes a cascading problem that once initiated might not be stoppable, you really have to change the epistemic framework of good things are mostly good, progress at all costs, history is written by the winners, we kind of ignore the ugly parts, and let's keep pushing and focusing on the good side of technology for some very limited definition of good, because the destructive applications at that scale are large enough to actually destroy the entire playing field, where the positive applications just don't actually get to matter anymore. So there's an increasing kind of, at exponential scale, exponential constructive and destructive forces both. The destructive forces become larger than the playing field can handle in the game in. So with exponential tech, you either figure out how to prevent and internalize externalities, or the game eventually self-terminates. Yep. And so the type of process that we've used for all of history until now is itself self-terminating.
Yep. So could I pause you for a second there? Because I think that's a lot of juicy stuff there. I'm reminded of Talib's and Yanir Baryam's precautionary principle here, which is the idea that even if something you think it's going to be really good with a 99% chance of being really good, but it has a very, very small percentage chance of actual ruin or existential risk, then it's well, then you shouldn't do it, And when we live in this world where everything is interconnected and where everything is becoming more powerful, then that lose side, that destructive side can become, it becomes, we have to change kind of our ways given our exponential tech. So let me follow up on that for a quick second here, which is, if we're trying to change our ways here and we're trying to be kind of taking all the externalities into account, how can we begin to start to do that?
Mm-hmm. So great question. Again, I'll say one other thing that I think leads some of the context.
Great.
One of the important things to consider when we think about the topic of negative externalities, so one thing we just said is the kind of entropic gradient, right? So we have to factor that. Another key thing is the topic of weaponization. Yep. If I create a new technology and it is the capacity to affect change through the causal lever on choice, right? I'm going to make a choice. My technological understanding of some mechanism allowed me to make a technology that's a big lever on my choice. So my choice has a bigger effect than it did before. Well, that same technological capacity can be a lever on lots of kinds of choices, right? And so one of the things we have to understand is that the moment we actually deploy a type of asymmetric technology, then it gets reverse engineered, iterated upon, and utilized for all purposes that are incentivized by all agents. And so I just had some guys talk with me the other day about an AI project they were working on, of how they could use some AI information technology that was novel. They just developed to get out some type of what they thought were positive political agendas to solve some current near-term problems. And I'm like, and you don't think that the other sides that have as much incentive and pretty good intel will pay attention to the new technology you have, reverse engineer it, and utilize it for the other purposes instantly? And they thought about it, and they're like, well, I guess that will happen. And I said, now take all of the sides in this multi-agent dynamic that all have rivalrous incentive to weaponize the technology against each other for their agendas, and all you do is up the ante of the playing field. And so nukes didn't actually make us safer. It seemed like they made us safer, but we actually have increased risk of existential risk from nuclear warfare relative to a world that had just never developed nukes. Yeah. Right? And so this is the multipolar trap, where each agent doing the thing that seems like it provides, and whether the agent is a person or a country or a company or a whatever, each agent doing the thing that seems like it's best for what they care about in the near term actually leads to a system disposition that is worse for the system as a whole over the long term. And this is what we call a multipolar trap, or a race to the bottom, right? A tragedy of the commons and arms race are all examples of this. And with exponential tech, we have an exponential race to the bottom type scenario. So one thing we can say is, in terms of goals or necessary criteria of system design, design constraints, is that we have to solve not just for some multipolar trap, but categorically for the class of multipolar traps. As long as you have a rivalrous incentive to utilize technology in a way that will directly or indirectly cause harm, you have a near-term incentive to do that, and you have exponential tech, and anytime anyone deploys it, everyone will be using it for rivalrous purposes, we are actually completely fucked.
Yeah. So can I pause you for a second there on that great end? So I agree with this, and this is something that you call like the generator functions of X risk, and these are these multipolar traps. And you can look at it when you think about the existential risks that exist today. There are things like nuclear security, and that's an arms race. It's like, couldn't we have stopped at maybe 3 nukes or something? But no, we have thousands of nukes. And you think about biotech, again, it's like people doing things that are in these win-lose game dynamics where if they stop and if they don't go quicker, and same with like artificial intelligence alignment, it's like, ooh, maybe Google and Baidu and Chinese governments and whoever are going to be nice around and try to be safe, but actually they're going to be in this win-lose game dynamic where if they're the first ones to get AGI, then they will have lots of rewards, and so there's a disincentive to kind of chill and wait for the safety things. And something like climate change obviously is an example of that's like a perfect example of the tragedy of the commons, where it didn't matter that much at the beginning when we started the Industrial Revolution that we were pushing stuff into the atmosphere, but as you say, once it gets exponential, then and we ignore that externality, then we're in one of these multipolar traps where no one's caring about the Earth, and then everybody gets screwed. So I agree with all that. I also agree with you in saying this weaponization piece is a very interesting one. And it takes this weird mindset that we talked about a little bit before, with this weird kind of omni-considerate mindset where you have to kind of, and this is both powerful from an individual perspective where you try to steel man the other person, but it's also very powerful from this kind of systems perspective where you say, hey, if I do something and, well, maybe it's good for me, but what happens if everybody does that? Then is it still good? And is the thing that I'm using, the tool, and I just did a podcast on new power, these kinds of new power, are those tools and those kinds of powerful things, how are they going to be used by quote unquote the other side? You need to think about that in terms of this weaponization piece. So I agree with all of you here. One thing that I might be worried about, just as a heads up, is like this, to some extent, I think that people might get stuck in a trap right now, which is what I would call maybe like a postmodernist trap, where it's like we had been in the world of modernism. We were excited by the world. We said, hey, we're going to be nationalists. We're going to go. And then postmodernism came around and we rejected those myths and we said, no, nothing can be real. And like everything is kind of gradients or whatever. And it feels like maybe a similar thing here where you say like, oh man, Reese, we need to think about all the externalities all the time, or like have omni consideration all the time. Or like, how can we then make choices if we have to be worried about the externalities kind of everything?
Yeah, great question. And as you can guess, what I'm going to advocate as an adequate epistemic and ethical framework is not postmodernism.
Nice.
A couple more parts that we need to construct in here is, so one thing regarding weaponization, and just a very simple practical thought for people who are wanting to do good. I was having this conversation with Tom Chi the other day, and he's a really brilliant prototyper, inventor, roboticist, technologist working on good things for the world. And we were talking about this problem of weaponization, and cognizant of that, his approach, and I think this is a approach that Bucky Fuller laid out very clearly, and others have, is let's take technology that already exists for weaponized purposes and start to popularize how to use it for actually positive purposes. So we're not increasing the technological power landscape. We're repurposing the shitty power to better power. And so we aren't actually going to be driving a multipolar trap in a race to the bottom. We are within the current landscape of not having solved for multipolar traps categorically yet. We're at least driving a race to the top. And I think this is a really key idea. So when he's looking at how do we take drone tech that already exists for military purposes and sucks, we're not going to make fundamentally better weaponizable drone tech, but we're going to use it to plant a bunch of trees to pull a bunch of CO2 out and stabilize topsoil and other things. You have a much lower risk of weaponization in that approach. And so I just want to offer that as one very simple kind of strategy that people can think about. Now, that still doesn't mean that a particular approach won't have externalities and doesn't need thought about. Of course, if I take a desertified area and plant trees for the goal of sequester CO2, and so I take whatever genetically engineered plant sequesters CO2 the fastest and just plant a shit ton of it, I might get all kinds of ecological problems as a result of anything from monocropping to invasive species to whatever else, right? So I still have to think about complexity, but I don't think about weaponization, increasing the potential of the power landscape as much. So that's one consideration. Next, I want to go on to something about multipolar traps, but do you want to say anything on that part first?
No. Yep, go to multipolar traps. Thank you for checking, though.
So, for people who aren't familiar with this topic well yet, there's an article on Slate Star Codex called Meditations on Moloch that is one of the best articles on that whole site, I think, and one of the better introductions to the concept of multipolar traps. I will share, whether we get to it on this podcast or another time, a different set of insights about a categorical solution to multipolar traps, but just so that people understand them a little bit and why they are so hard to get out of. You mentioned a couple examples, but I want to highlight the system dynamics a little bit more explicitly. Because as you said, this is actually not the source of one X risk. This is a generator function for all X risks, is one way of thinking about it. And so if we don't resolve it categorically, then we just kind of move the timescales a tiny bit. So let's take a tragedy of the commons. It started a long time ago, and we just say, okay, we got a number of tribes that are all seeking to increase their own well-being. They are in an implicit competition with each other for the same scarce resources. At a certain point, that implicit competition, economic resource extraction-wise, can become so problematic that they move into an explicit militaristic competition, which we can see how it happened. But let's just even start to take first, okay, I don't want to cut all the trees down because I actually really like the forest. I have a whole spirituality about our connection with nature, and we need the forest to live because that's where the animals live that we hunt, and etc. And I actually don't need that many trees. I just need a few trees. So I'm only going to cut down those few trees, except the population of these other tribes and the total number of tribes has been increasing, and they're all cutting down trees. And so I know that if I don't cut down the trees, it still doesn't ensure that there's a forest because the other guy's going to cut down the trees, so there's not going to be a forest anyways. But he's actually my competitor because he's going to use those for weapons, weapon making, that if I don't also do so, he will actually end up killing my people, or he will be able to outlive us through a famine because of total amount of economic accumulation or whatever it is. So since I can't actually keep the forest because of those guys, and even if I tried to make a truce with this one tribe, there's this other tribe that we just can't even talk to. And so if anybody does the fucked up thing of cutting down a bunch of trees, then we are in a race to all get them first, to keep the other guy from having them, because there is no incentive in leaving them, and because then it's best for us to have them. So now we cut down a lot more trees than we need. And so, but they only do that because they're thinking the same thing about us. We're the fucked up other tribe to them, right? And so now we all realize that we have to increase how good our axes and saws are and how many people are cutting down forest to cut it down faster, because we're all racing to get that wood, or the pigs or the whales or the farmland or the whatever it is, right? And so now we are not just destroying the world upon which we depend. We are in a race to destroy it as fast as possible. And if we don't, we assume it will still get destroyed and it will be worse for us and we have no chance of winning, right? So this is a scenario where anyone does the fucked up thing and it sets a precedent for everyone else to actually be better off near term if they do the fucked up thing, even though it leads to everyone being worse off over the long term. So we have a decoupling of the incentive of each agent from the well-being of the other agents in the commons. And as a result, because of the interdependency with the commons, we have a decoupling of our own short-term advantage with our own long-term well-being. If I take the case of tragedy of the commons, we can see how recalcitrant and tricky those are. If we take the case of an arms race, we see the same thing. And the tricky part here is we say, okay, we haven't succeeded with nuclear deproliferation all that well. All that we have is more and more countries having existential level power, so we can't even have something like mutually assured destruction anymore. And so, and obviously exponential tech can make that non-state level actors and not even traceable types of dynamics. But now let's take a current example. Let's take AI weapons, right? Weaponized drones, etc. There is no general in the world that wants to live in the world where those weapons are ubiquitous.
Yep.
There's no military contractor, military hawk, whatever, who thinks that's actually a nicer world to live in. Everybody knows that our chance of all being killed by AI drones goes up if any of us fucking build the things. And so it is a comprehensively worse world for all of us and our kids and our grandkids. And yet, we're all going to build them as fast as we fucking can because the other guy's going to build them. And we say, well, okay, no, we need to create an agreement. And there are efforts being made to do this. But all that has to happen is one group doesn't join the agreement, and now we don't want them to get the weaponized drones first, so we got to do it. Or everybody joins the agreement, but we're pretty sure they're going to be defecting on it in secret, right? Because they would have all of the incentive to do so. So they keep the agreement, and then in a black project, they defect on the agreement while continuing to disinform us that they're keeping it. And because we think they're doing that, we're also defecting on it. We're trying to disinform them. We're trying to spy on the way they're disinforming us. And now all of our resources are going to both making the world as bad as we can, as fast as we can, while disinforming each other and ruining the information ecology maximally, right? We will go extinct because of multipolar traps on our current trajectory. If we do not figure out how to solve them, these have been the dynamics that have led to the collapse of societies for as long as we've had societies. And it's just, when the Roman Empire fell, as big as it wasn't the whole world. When the Incan or the Mayan or the Egyptian or the Mesopotamian or the Aztec Empire fell, which they all fucking fell, it wasn't everything. As soon as we have a fully interconnected global supply chain where there's not a country in the world that could actually build the computer that we're speaking on from scratch, that the mining, refinement, hardware tech, software tech, etc., is happening across the whole world, then we realize that the civilization, that we only know how to build civilizations that collapse, and that the collapse of a fully globalized civilization, and where the environmental damage that's happening is at the level of the whole biosphere, not just a particular ecosystem, we say, oh, the way that we have always been, multipolar traps are old, the way we have always been, that has always caused wars and environmental destruction and etc., is at a level of magnitude that we don't actually get to make it through. So it's not that the problems are different in kind, they're just different in magnitude and speed, where that ends up being different in kind because you don't actually get to keep going through the boom and bust cycles associated. So we either solve for multipolar traps, which means agency misalignment, or the human experiment completes.